Testing. Recording of interview conducted with Mr. Michael Comay, former ambassador of Israel to the United Nations, on 9th of May 1977 for the Oral Records Center of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry. The first question I want to ask you, Mr. Comay, is if you could briefly trace for us your association with the Zionist movement in South Africa till your actual Aliyah. Where did it start, and what were the main points?
I grew up in a small town called George, where we had a tiny Jewish community. It was headed by my father, and they maintained a small synagogue, they maintained a Zionist society, and they had an annual campaign, so that throughout my childhood I had some contact with these matters. After I left university, I went to the bar in Cape Town. I became very active in the movement, associated with Jacob Gideon, who was the driving force of Zionism in Cape Town, and a small group of us who were together at the bar. There were some more senior than others. Joseph Herbstein, Bobby Bloch, and my own contemporary Gerald Gordon and myself were all associated with Gideon in the Zionist movement in Cape Town generally, and in particular we helped him to edit and produce the South African, not the Zionist Record, the South African
Jewish Chronicle.
Jewish Chronicle. This continued till the war broke out.
So this was in the 1930s?
From the beginning of the 1930s, and for that more than a decade. And I was active in the campaigns that happened and going around speaking, and we took a full part in the Zionist movement in South Africa, I would say for a dozen years up to the outbreak of war.
Right.
When the war came about, I joined the army, and for the next 5 years I was in uniform, mostly in the Middle East. I ended the war in London, in Britain, doing a staff job there. Before the war was over, in 1944, I was approached by the president and chairman of the Federation at that time, Nikolai Kirchner and Barney Geering, with a proposal that I should go to Palestine as a special representative of the Zionist movement and the Jewish community in South Africa. The post-war position was unknown, it was confused, nobody knew what the political situation would be, nobody knew what opportunities there would be for Aliyah, for investment, for tourism, and they wanted some high-level person who would be attached to the Jewish agency, live in this country, and they knew that I was seriously thinking of Aliyah after the war was over. Mm-hmm. I declined the offer at that time, said I would not. They also said that Smuts had been approached. He thought it was a good idea, and that Smuts was willing at that stage to give me a discharge from the army in order to take up such a position. Mm-hmm. Which was an indication of his own goodwill and his interest. Yes. But I declined. I said that I was in the army, and I thought I should stay in the army till the war was over. As I say, I ended the war in 1945 in London, and when the war was over, I was still in uniform, I was a major in the South African forces at that time. I attended the first London conference called by Dr. Weizmann just at the end of the war. There I was again approached with the same idea, and this time I said that I would be willing to consider it, but it would depend on whether my wife was of the same mind. She'd never been to Palestine, although I had been there quite often when I was serving in the Middle East with the 8th Army, spending leaves in this country. Anyway, arrangements were made for her to come up on a visit.
She was then in South Africa?
She was in South Africa, and we decided to come and settle here. Then I accepted a 3-year arrangement with the Zionist Federation. I was to come here, I was to be attached to the agency. My official title was Special Representative of the South African Zionist Federation. And when I asked what I was expected to do, they said that was up to me.
Were you an employee officially of the Jewish agency or
No.
of the Zionist Federation in South Africa?
No, I had a 3-year contract with the Zionist Federation in South Africa for this assignment. And the nature of the assignment, I would set up an office here, and how the thing would develop was something that was left up to me. I would, of course, keep in touch with the Federation, and we'd see what could be done in the light of circumstances which were then quite obscure.
I see.
At the end of 1945, therefore, I came straight out of the army. I got back to South Africa from the Middle East and London, and I made my arrangements to leave. My wife and children stayed behind for another year till things were more settled. I came here on my own. I was given an office in the Jewish Agency building, and engaged a secretary and started to look around and see what could be done. Not much could be done at that time. The political situation was much too confused and uncertain. There wasn't much to be done in practical matters, the kind of things which were afterwards developed by the Federation's office, which was set up in Tel Aviv. But not much in the way of aliyah, economic ties, investment, trade, tourism, all these things. What did happen, in fact, was that I was almost immediately drawn in by the Mr. Sheret, who was then Shetok, and the political department of the Jewish Agency. I was drawn in an informal way into their work. When I came here, it was not long before the arrival of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which came here in early 1946. I helped to prepare the documentation that was presented to that committee. I appeared personally, briefly, as a witness before the committee, as a spokesman for the South African Zionist movement. Generally endorsed the position that the agency leaders were taking up.
The Zionist Federation and the Board of Deputies actually also sent a document, an official document at the time, and Simon Cooper and one or two others came for a time as well.
So that in 1946 a position developed where, although I kept in constant touch with the Federation, reported to them on what was going on, attended to whatever needs there were, a position developed where my main activity was participating in the general work of the political department.
I see.
Later that year, when I had an opportunity, I raised the matter with Mr. Kirchner and Mr. Gehring and said, well, I felt a little badly about this because I felt that from a strictly South African point of view, I wasn't devoting myself really to the assignment which I had accepted. I was being drawn into the general political work, the political struggle, and I didn't think this was entirely fair to the Federation, and therefore I would be quite willing to release them from the arrangement that they'd made with me, but they insisted that I shouldn't. They said after all, they were also part of the agency and part of the general struggle, and if my services could be of use to the Jewish agency on the political side, this was all part of the same cause, and they had no objection whatsoever to my continuing along that, and then when opportunity offered, attending to other things as well. So they were not willing to accept my stepping out of this arrangement, and in fact it continued right up to the declaration of the state.
I see.
So that while I remained on the payroll of the Federation, kept in touch with the Federation, looked after people who came here, and sent the Federation regular political reports and so forth, they had the feeling that they had someone of their own on the spot who could keep them in the picture and who could convey anything that they wanted to convey. Knowing full well that, as I said, my main burden of my work was the more general work of the political department of the agency. For 1946, 1947, 48, I paid several visits to South Africa, and at least two of them I travelled around and met communities and spoke to them, and of course consultations with the executive in Johannesburg and so forth. So I tried as best I could to divide my time between and not be involved in the political work, general political work, to the extent that I would altogether neglect my South African link.
Now that brings us to 48. Just two questions to fill in this period. In that period of the 1930s, when you were involved in the circle around Gideon, were you associated with any of the political groupings, and did you have anything to do with groups like Habonim that were then emerging? Or were you what one might call a non-party person from the beginning within the Zionist Federation?
I was a non-party person from the beginning. I didn't feel, though I had a general interest in Zionist socialism and so forth, I didn't regard myself as a card-carrying member of any specific political grouping within the Federation.
I understand.
There were quite a number of even the senior members of the Federation at that time who were in the same position. Yes,
sure. Now, coming now to the period of your visits prior to the creation of the state to South Africa. On one occasion, it may not have been the only occasion that you met with Smuts, but this was an interview on the 21st of the 1st, 1948, at a time when you were also presumably engaged in the question of what became Machal activity in South Africa. And this was from a report that you delivered to the political committee under the chairmanship of Louis Pinkus at the time, in which you concluded, while the talk was useful simply as a contact visit, I cannot suggest that it revealed any desire on the Prime Minister's part to intervene actively. In referring both to Britain and to the United Nations, I hinted broadly that it was important to try to get proper cooperation from them, but his reaction was non-committal. I doubt whether an official delegation to the Prime Minister would produce any practical results at this stage. This reflected a period in which Smuts, about whose affinities for the Zionist movement and desire to help there can be no doubt, was perhaps not particularly useful or not in a position to be useful. And this particular point interests me. how would you evaluate the role of Smuts in helping the efforts towards the creation of the state around about 47, 48?
I think the significant talk I had with him was before the one to which you referred. In the middle, I think it was in June 1947, after we were already working at the United Nations, and I was a staff member of the Jewish Agency delegation at the United Nations. When UNSCOP was appointed and was in the country, I came back here for a while, and then it was decided that I would go down to South Africa. Our own ideas of what we wanted to get out of UNSCOP and the United Nations had become fairly clear. A partition plan with a Jewish and independent Jewish state after a transition period with the best territorial deal that we could get out of the United Nations. I had earlier that year gone on a special mission to Australia and New Zealand to enlist the support of those two governments for our position at the discussions which would take place later that year at the United Nations. This was before the appointment of UNSCOP, in about March of 1947. In Australia, I'd seen Dr. Evatt. In New Zealand, I'd seen Peter Fraser, the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. I came back and then went to New York and worked with the delegation. In June, decided that I should go down to South Africa, report to the Federation what was going on, but primarily for the purpose of trying to gain the support of General Smuts for our ideas on partition. I went down there with a letter to him from Dr. Weitzman. He received me in his office in Pretoria, and we had quite a long talk about it, which I found him very unsympathetic towards the whole idea.
Of partition?
Yes. It was not an easy interview. Firstly, he wouldn't hear from, he wouldn't listen to any criticism of British mandatory policy. In fact, he defended it. I don't have, it's a long time ago, I don't have a note that I made at the time of the conversation, but I remember its general content fairly clearly. He said Britain was not to blame, that if anybody was to blame for the situation which had arisen, it was the Jews and the Zionist movement. He said that he pointed out that he, as one of the authors of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate system, had assumed that if we were given this opportunity after World War I, we would make the most of it.
Yes.
We would bring people into the country, we'd settle it rapidly, we would develop it as fast as possible, and we would not waste any time.
Yes, he felt this strongly because he expressed this even in letters to Weitzman that I've seen.
Yes,
Yeah.
He expressed great disappointment with our actual record after the Balfour Declaration and the mandate. He said he knew from his friend, he had a great reverence almost for Dr. Weitzman. He says he knew from his friend Dr. Weitzman had gone to the United States and elsewhere to the rich Jews to try and raise the relatively modest amount of capital that he hadn't been able to get it from them. This he mentioned. He said that his understanding was that not many immigrants had come into the country in the first years. And he said, well, when we gave you your chance, nobody could look into the future and know how much time you had. As it turned out, he said, you had much less time than we thought. He said, well, in the 30s, the world had changed. There was the rise of the totalitarian states, Hitler, Mussolini. Britain was on the defensive. He said, and things looked very bad in the late 30s. And there was a danger of war. The Germans and the Italians were making headway in the Arab world. He said Britain started to retreat from the mandate under these circumstances. Who can blame her? And she started it with the best of intentions, but the old historical circumstances had changed, and she had to take account of the importance of the Middle East and their interests and influence in the Arab world. And he was not only a Zionist, he was a great Anglophile in his life. And he made clear that he was in the situation that had arisen. He didn't hold Britain to blame. And he blamed us for not taking advantage of the good years when we could have done so. Mm-hmm. He said, and by the late 30s, our chance was over.
Did he also
because
say...
the international situation was not such that Britain could any longer push forward the idea of the Jewish national home. Mm-hmm. He said, now you come to me with this compromise. He said of cutting up the country, and I'd explained to him more or less what we thought might come out of the UN discussions and what we thought we might settle for. And he said he regarded that as very unsatisfactory. And he said, look at this. He said the whole country, if you'd done what you should have, the whole country should have been a Jewish state. Because that was what I, for one, contemplated at the beginning. Mm-hmm. He said it hasn't happened that way. What you've shown me as a possible Jewish state in part of the country, he said, is a travesty. It's an anticlimax. I don't remember the exact phrase, but this was the spirit in which he spoke. It was an anticlimax. He said, who's going to defend that? How can you defend this territory? How can you take your people into it and settle it? It's quite inadequate, and you won't. The Arabs are against you. You won't be able to come to terms with them. You won't be able to make something decent of the state. He says, I can't get myself to go along with this. And we talked about it some more, but I came away and reported to Dr. Weitzman and to the executive when I got back here, and also, of course, to the Federation in Johannesburg, that Smuts had not definitely committed himself to support the partition proposal. And he made clear that he said, well, in due course I'll have to discuss this with my cabinet. I'm giving you my own opinion. Mm-hmm. Of course, he
came around to supporting partition.
Let me tell you what happened later. When the debates on the UNSCOP plan took place in New York later that year, at the General Assembly in New York, I was again back with the delegation working there. And Harry Lawrence was the head of the delegation. Mm. And we had every reason to believe that Australia, New Zealand, Canada would They were not only indicated that they would support the partition plan, they were actively working to push it through. South African delegation remained completely out of it. They remained on the sidelines. And I saw Lawrence several times. I couldn't pin him down, even to vote for the partition plan. And I went to Dr. Weitzman at the Plaza Hotel where he was staying. I used to go in nearly every day and tell him what had been going on at UN. And I said to him, Dr. Weitzman, I can't get anywhere with the South African delegation. I said, from my own visit to South Africa, I know that Smuts was unhappy about this solution. He didn't think it would work, he didn't like it. And his delegation here tell me that they've got no definite instructions from their government about how they should vote on it. The only thing to do is for, they said, is for you to send a personal cable to Smuts. I said he has a great regard for you, and if you explained to him that with all its shortcomings this was the only way left open to us to proceed and to open possibilities of immigration and so forth, that there was no other feasible alternative to this, and you appealed to him to support it. Then out of deference to your wishes, I think he will instruct his delegation accordingly, but otherwise I don't know whether I haven't been able to put them in the yes column. They said, all right, and I drafted a suitable cable and brought it to him, and he signed it. And we sent it off, and it was acknowledged by Smuts, and then a little while afterwards, Lawrence came and told me that they now had instructions to vote for it. Now, the effect, if I were to sum all this up in answer to your question, I would say that unlike Australians, New Zealand and Canada, South Africa played no active part in promoting or gaining support for the partition plan, and we even had some difficulty in getting its own vote lined up behind it.
I see. But then once the partition resolution was passed, between that period and the creation of the state itself, I know I've seen the documents from the Smuts papers themselves,
yes,
actual instructions sent by Smuts, which virtually give almost a carte blanche to the delegation from the point of view of doing whatever the Zionist requests may be. So it seems that the crucial problem was about partition itself. In a strange way, wouldn't you agree then, it was really out of his hyper-Zionist motivation that he had his hesitations about it, together with his pro-British
I would
feeling.
say that there were three factors which influenced him. You mentioned them. One was a sense of disappointment with comparing the situation in 1947 with what may have been the vision that he had and that he got from Dr. Weitzman in 1917 or in 1920, in the immediate the end of World War I. A sense of genuine, almost resentment that we hadn't taken more advantage of the opportunity to be given to us. I remember one remark he made to me. He said, it doesn't happen often in history that a people is given a second chance. If you get a second chance now, will you do any better than you did the first time? Now, that is a very revealing remark about his own state of mind.
Yes.
Secondly, on the merits of the partition plan itself, as to whether it would lead to a peaceful settlement of the conflict, as to whether or whether it would simply plunge us into war, whether it really was an adequate basis for immigration and development. He was skeptical. He wasn't sold on the merits of the plan. And that is why, knowing that, when I drafted a personal cable from Dr. Weissman to him at a later stage, I didn't stress that it was a good plan or a satisfactory plan, but simply that it was the least of all the various evils, that of all that we'd reached a dead end with the mandate, and we had to carry on with our work, and this was the only alternative that presented itself. Sort of in the spirit of making the best of a bad job, to know that in spite of whatever misgivings he had about it, there wasn't anything better, or that we could turn to, and we couldn't leave things as they were. So sort of the ein breira approach, which was the only one I thought it would commend itself to him. But in my own efforts to sell him the advantages and the opportunities of the partition plan, he wasn't very impressed by. That's number two. Right. Number three, his own sympathy for the predicament that Britain found herself in over Palestine. Right. He kept on saying to me that he's in constant touch with London and the British government. He understands the possible situation and their problem. In other words, he expressed a good deal of understanding and sympathy for what he regarded the possible situation that Britain found herself in.
I see.
And he certainly was very reluctant to, ironically, more reluctant than Australians, New Zealanders, or the Canadians to take a line independent of Britain, which might be embarrassing to Britain. So he felt this inhibition about not being on a problem which was a tremendous burden to Britain, and which was a British problem, not a South African one. He was most reluctant to take a position which would cut across British policy, or be independent of British policy, or harmful to British policy.
I see.
Now, if you add these three factors together, I think they sufficiently explain his dragging his feet over going along with this. Therefore, I found him, as I say, more inhibited on this than I found Dr. Everett in Australia, and found Peter Fraser in New Zealand, who's very loyal to Britain, or Lester Pearson and the Canadians. The support of these British dominions for our position was very important politically and internationally, and psychologically, because the rest of the world sat up and took notice of the fact that the British dominions, as they were still called, most closest to Britain and most loyal to Britain, had become convinced that this was the only way to proceed on the whole conflict, even although it wasn't a way which Britain favoured. And this impressed other countries.
Right.
But if you mention the period after the partition, between the partition decision and the Bertha Spate, that 6 month period. I think Smuts, as I say, I saw him in January, which you mentioned. I was sent, the particular purpose of my going to South Africa in January of 1948 was not on this occasion primarily to see Smuts with the South African government, but at Ben-Gurion's request to try and stimulate the Machal business and the search for arms, for money and so forth. I came back from New York at the beginning of December after the partition decision was adopted. I hadn't yet packed my suitcase when Ben-Gurion sent for me. And he, in my experience, he was always, he was a very far-sighted man. He was always one jump ahead of his colleagues. And he said to me, look, this partition decision is a great thing. It's of historical importance. He said, but it's clear to me that if we're going to set up a state, we'll have to fight for it. The Arabs will fight us. He says, and therefore we've got 6 months in which to prepare for war. This was in December 47. And he said, now, you know, the Haganah, we will be up against not local Arabs, but we're up against trained Arab armies with modern equipment and so forth, which we don't have. He said, we got 6 months, we have to work intensively. He says, now the South African community could be very important to us. He said, they have a lot of boys who fought to saw war service in particular areas that we don't have, the Air Force, Tank Corps, people specialized arms of the service like that, which we're very poor. And he said you must go down and tell the Federation, tell the community that we need volunteers and help set up machinery for this. Anything in the way of military supplies that can come from there and so forth, also to the good. The most important thing we need are trained men as volunteers. This, I say, was 6 months before the state.
Yes.
And therefore the main purpose of that visit to South Africa, where I not only had talks with the Federation executive, but also travelled around the country addressing meetings and meeting people and Rhodesia, was to stimulate and give some guidance for the beginnings of the Machal movement, which had already been put into operation there. Yes. But of course I took the opportunity of going to see Smuts and reporting to him again on the developments. And then we're heading again during that 6 months, as you know, into new international political difficulties at UN and elsewhere.
Now, on that score, I want to remind you that a few days before Smuts took the step of recognizing Israel de facto, which was regarded by some of his colleagues as a mistake, and that it might alienate some of the English elements in South Africa. And he was apparently hesitant for a while in doing so. A telegram arrived from you to Geering, mentioning again that same problematic constellation, namely that Australia, Canada, New Zealand were filling in the yes column, as it were, but that they were also being influenced by the hesitancy of South Africa, which was particularly striking since Smuts was involved. Yes. That was more or less what was in the telegram.
Yes. Yes.
So it seems that again it reappeared. Would you say at that stage, though, that your impression was that it was because of the elections that were due to take place within 1 or 2 days that Smuts, my conjecture was, that Smuts would have preferred to wait till after the election and not alienate anybody unnecessarily, but because of that telegram, he realized that the issue was very serious at that moment, and he therefore took the step. Is that, do you think, a correct impression?
It's difficult for me to say because I wasn't in South Africa at the time, around the time of the end of the mandate. And at the state, in fact, I was at the United Nations in New York at that time. We were glad when the recognition did come through, and I'm glad to hear that maybe the telegram was helpful. I sent to Gehring, but the recognition was important, and I was afraid with all this back history that I tell you about my own previous contacts with Smuts. I was afraid that he would hang back.
I see.
I couldn't assess what the domestic reasons might be, and elections were pending, and we knew that British influence was operating against us, and we knew other capitals, and we assumed that it would operate in Pretoria as well to hold up recognition. I was afraid that this would influence Smuts. I guess that there might also be, knowing the attitude of many of the English-speaking South Africans, that this might be a factor in his calculations. But this I couldn't tell from a distance whether that really was so or not.
I see. I want now to change the plan of my questions, because I'm taking into account the time factor, and to jump to the last question, and then in the time allowed to come back to the period immediately after 48. In the period around about the time of your appointment to the United Nations as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, which coincided with the critical period of the breakdown of relations between South Africa and Israel, with its deep implications for the Jewish community. I remind you that the crucial dates were approximately October 1961, when Israel voted with one other country, Holland, as it happens, against Eric Louw's right, against Eric Louw actually expressing South Africa's opinion in one of the debates. And that became the turning point, because that was taken up in a very inflated fashion in South Africa. And the Jewish community actually, both the board and the Fed, made a statement that was mildly disapproving of Israel, basing it ostensibly on the grounds that here was an issue of freedom of speech in the United Nations, and Israel should never have opposed it. This was criticized in Israel and by some of the South African Jews, and then the problem escalated in the 1960s, up to about 1967, when with the Six-Day War, relations again improved. Now, during that period, although you weren't directly concerned with, well, actually you were, because those votes were taken under your control at the United Nations. Even if I understand that the committees dealing with it were not committees which you were actually attending all the time. What could you tell us that stands out, even if it's only impressionistic, that stems from your unique position as a person who was a former South African, and this was known by the South African delegation there, and by presumably also the Arab countries, or some of them. To what extent did that affect your functioning, and how did this come to you in various ways during that period?
As the permanent representative during that period, and therefore the head of the delegation for the General Assemblies where the South African issues came up, I kept maintained a close personal interest in the way we handled these issues in the committees, and tried to control it as much as I could.
On what principles?
I can answer that in two ways. Firstly, what my own view was, and secondly, to say my own view was not always the position that we actually took in practice, because although I had a great deal of authority in the absence of the foreign minister, who was then Mrs. Mayer, when she was in New York, she, in sensitive matters of this kind, she took decisions as to how they should be handled, which were binding on me and the rest of the delegation. And it's no secret that her own feelings about South Africa and her feelings about our cultivating friendship with the black African countries, which were then becoming independent and coming in, were quite strong. So that certain attitudes were taken on behalf of the delegation, of which I personally sometimes disapproved, which I was a dissenting voice, but being loyal to my minister and to the government, to carry them out. The particular incident you mentioned with Eric Lowe was a case in point. I was at the United Nations. I was occupying the seat when this question blew up, when the African states put forward a motion which would have the effect of muzzling Mr. Lowe and not letting him, giving him an opportunity to state his case fully. I thought this was wrong. Whereas we could not, the position of this, it was difficult for us to associate ourselves with him. I want to say here that apart from South Africa's the general attitude towards South Africa, Mr. Lowe himself was very unpopular and had
was very unpopular.
Yes. Nevertheless, I felt that there was a principle of the right to speak for any member state which was involved, and Israel, from our own traditions and as a state itself under attack at the United Nations, we should not go along with any attempt to stifle free assessment. Therefore, although couldn't go as far as voting against the African motion, I personally would not have voted for it. But I was another member of my delegation who felt differently, got into touch with Mrs. Mayer, who was not in the building at the time, and she ruled that we should vote with the Africans. And
although it meant just the Netherlands and Israel and all the other Western countries either
yes.
absented themselves or
yes.
abstained.
Well, this was her decision. I felt sufficiently strongly about it to not be prepared myself to participate in the vote. It was delegated to another member of the delegation. I absented myself. I thought it was unfortunate, and I thought so then, I think so now.
Were you also thinking of the Jewish community in South Africa? Or
yes,
was that...
Yes. I was knowing the South African scene as I did. I thought this wouldn't do them any good in their own relations with the government. But I thought to start with it was wrong in principle. Now,
did this have any effect on did you have any personal comments made to you by Eric Lowe's delegation, or
my own personal relations with the South African delegation were always very friendly. They spoke freely to me and I to them, and I often explained to them that both from the point of view of our own strong feelings about any racial discrimination as Jews, and from our own point of view that we couldn't associate ourselves with South African policies, and that we would have to take a position in principle. My own guidance to my colleagues within the delegation always was, when you asked me what my position was that we should take a clear stand in principle, that we should not do this in a way which was offensive, that we had no reason whatsoever to behave in a way which the South African government might find as insulting to them, or as hurtful to their dignity, that we should state our position and not be afraid to do so, but state it in a reasonable way and in restrained language. And I felt this so clearly that I insisted, although I was under great pressure during General Assemblies and running around and busy with many things and reporting home, insisted that whoever represented us in the committees, these things, and want to make a statement, that he should submit the statement to my personal scrutiny. And I invariably deleted from our delegation statement in the committee, for whoever member of the delegation was, I invariably deleted from the statements any expressions which I thought were unnecessarily sharp. Or yes. There were various occasions when I took a line in the delegation or here in Jerusalem on South African matters, which was not quite that of Mrs. Meyer, who was on this issue was inclined to take a very strong and extreme position, almost an emotional position, which I respected and which I understood, but my own views were different. One case in point was after 1967, when I was back here, when a question arose before the government. No, before 67, a question arose from the government of renewing El Al's flights to South Africa. Now, Mrs. Meyer was opposed to it, and Mr. Ben-Gurion asked my opinion as the representative of the UN whether I thought this would do a great deal of damage to our relations with the African countries, and I said, in my opinion, it would not. I said they would accept it, they wouldn't make a serious issue of it with us, and the government decided against Mrs. Meyer's opinion to authorize the renewal of these.
Prior to that, it had been suspended? It
had been suspended for a long time because of the difficulties of overflying the Arab territory and so forth.
Did you ever hear Mrs. Meyer defend her position, taking into account the interests of the Jewish community?
Yes, Mrs. Meyer was always extremely sensitive to Jewish interests, the difficulties facing Jewish communities everywhere, very genuinely so. But she felt with the Jews in South Africa. Firstly, she felt that the difficulties that might be caused to them locally by our general policy in Africa and at the United Nations was regrettable, but that should not be the decisive factor for the State of Israel. That there was a great deal in, firstly, that our position at the United Nations on apartheid and so forth was a matter of principle by which a Jewish state had to take a perfectly clear and straightforward position, and it couldn't obscure that position or moderate it because of the South African Jews. Secondly, she thought it would be uncomfortable maybe with the South African Jews, but it wouldn't destroy their position in South Africa or undermine it. They could say they were loyal South Africans, but she thought that the price we'd have to pay in South Africa was exaggerated. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, she attached great importance to in our overall position, especially in the emerging third world, of our building up this network of relations with the black African countries. She was to a considerable extent the architect of our African policy. She herself went on 2 extensive tours in these African countries. At the United Nations, she made a point always of meeting all their leaders and spending time with them and talking to them. She was attracted by the challenge of Israel being able to help them with technical aid and help them in their own development plans. And so forth. Now, when she weighed all these things up against any embarrassment that might be caused to the South African community, she thought, well, they must just put up with it. Now, I can't say that I myself was in fundamental disagreement with her, mm-hmm. But I kept on explaining to her, to my colleagues, that it wasn't just the substance of our position, it was also the manner of it. Yes. That I didn't want any different policy in Africa or at the United Nations, but I objected to our South Africans had always been friendly to us and helpful to us in our own affairs. We had a very important community, and at least we should take our position without unnecessarily hurting their feelings. They were sensitive, they felt isolated, and I thought this was. I said I'd never had any difficulties with the South African delegation at UN. They found they accepted our position. They didn't. They would have liked a different position, but what they reacted to very strongly was when they were being abused by the Africans, and they had a chip on their shoulders, and but when they saw Israel, whom they had nothing but friendly feelings to, they'd helped in many ways, whom they felt a very strong affinity. When they appeared to see Israel joining in the chorus of kicking South Africa, then they reacted strongly to it. I was, in my own mind, persuaded that we could maintain our principles in these matters and continue to develop our position in the black African continent, while at the same time retaining reasonably friendly ties with South Africa, that if one handled this diplomatically, there was no unavoidable clash between the two.
This would be a question. Can I put my finger on one point? Mr. Eshel in the Special Political Committee, when he spoke on the debates connected to apartheid, I noticed that he very rarely related directly to apartheid, but rather concentrated to a large extent on the influence of Nazism and the Jews' own history. Would you say that this was the kind of influence that you were trying to put onto the delegation generally?
May I say something, when you mention Eshel, may I say something here which is maybe a little amusing. When the South African issues first became prominent at the United Nations after we were members, we found that no less than 4 senior members of the delegation had been born in South Africa. Eban, who was born in the technical sense, he was a baby when he came back to Britain, and he had no memories of South Africa at all, but he was South African born, which the Arabs constantly reminded him of. Arthur Lurie, Reggie Kidron, and myself. So we decided it wouldn't be appropriate for a South African born member of the delegation to represent the delegation in these discussions. So we eventually...
This was about 1961,
no,
or you're talking about later?
Much earlier.
Earlier?
Right from the beginning.
Uh-huh.
So at that time we picked on Dr. Moshe Tov, who was our Latin American expert. I said to him, Moshe, have you ever been to South Africa? He said, no. I said, do you know anything about South Africa? He said, no. I said, all right, you're our representative on that committee. And after that, it became a kind of tradition that whichever member of the permanent delegation was our contact man with the Latin Americans, sort of took over the South African...
like Baromi.
Yes, with Tob and then Eshel and then Baromi. And, but I always sat with them and set the tone for them. I didn't always succeed. I was also subject to superior authority in the matter.
I see.
But the friction that developed between us and South Africa, and the unhappiness caused to the South African community over this, in my opinion, could have been avoided.
Without changing the principles, but by the manner in which
it was more tactful about it.
Mm-hmm. To what extent, you said that your relations with the South African delegation were always good, and that they really understood the basic position.
Yeah.
To what extent was the charge that you were South African born hurled at you in the forum of the United Nations or outside of it by the Arabs or African countries who may have been in doubt?
It didn't disturb the African countries. The Arabs constantly harped on it. One Arab spokesman in particular, it was Ahmed Shukeri.
Uh-huh.
He invariably referred to me as the Major from South Africa. It didn't, our African friends weren't particularly bothered by this.
They didn't have a prejudice against you because you were a white-born South African?
No, I didn't feel that. In
Well,
fact, on a personal level, the South African delegates often had quite amiable relations with many of the African delegates and could talk freely to them without affecting in the slightest the public positions that these delegates took up.
I understand. Were you aware of any serious differences of opinion in the Foreign Office here or in the government over the specific question of the Jewish community of South Africa and how policies towards South Africa would affect them? And secondly, were you aware of any pressure from the South African Jewish community? Of course, this was always discreet pressure, because their official stand was that they have no locus standi in regard to anything that Israel decides on as foreign policy. But I know that pressure was put and that they did make approaches to the government. Did this ever come to you?
Oh yes, I'm perfectly well aware of it. The people I remember on various occasions, Goering, Izzy Maisels, other South African Zionist leaders. Edelhorwitz quite strongly.
Yes.
Yeah, well, they always came to see me and always discussed it with me, and or I was present at their
What was the
meetings.
nature? How would you sum up your impression of the way they were approaching you and the Israel authorities? What really was the gist of what they were saying? Did they expect Israel to change its policy?
They expected Israel to try as far as possible to moderate its policy and certainly to present its position in a way which would not be unnecessarily hurtful to the feelings of the South Africans. They made these points. As I told you, I myself had some sympathy with it. Yes. I don't remember that any South African Zionist leader presumed to say to the Israel government that our basic position should be a different position in principle.
In other words, they didn't defend as South Africans the actual policies of the South African government.
No, they tried very often to explain things, to say that these matters were much more complicated and difficult when on the spot, and they were oversimplified from a distance, and the kind of slogans which one heard at the United Nations were no answer to the problem. They took occasion in these talks to explain something of the realities of the South African problem, but I don't recall that any of them pressed seriously for a fundamental shift in our position. Mm-hmm. They thought that we should be more careful about it, and try and be more restrained. We should avoid giving the impression that we were simply being dragged along by the Africans, or that we were so busy courting the favor of the Africans that we were willing to sacrifice our ties with South Africa. This feeling that they had worried them a great deal. All these matters were discussed with great frankness and openness, and members of the same family. They, I think, sometimes found Mrs. Meyer, who listened to them carefully and made note of their views, but she was sometimes a little unsympathetic to this aspect of the matter. I think she probably felt that those Jews who found life becoming too difficult in South Africa always had the option of coming to Israel.
Yes. Was there ever a serious review, a full-scale review of policies towards South Africa in which you participated a while back?
On several occasions. There was a genuine consciousness of this whole problem, and there were from time to time reviews at a policy level of our policy. I think that at a cabinet level it wasn't so much a matter of general policy reviews as specific issues coming up. One I mentioned as the El Al flying to South Africa, and what impact this will have on our work in Africa, and or our position at the United Nations.
I see.
I took a less serious view of it than others.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you would add on that? To jump back now a little to the period after the creation of the state. First of all, could you briefly sum up what were the various positions that you occupied in the Foreign Service from the time of the creation of the state?
My first position in the ministry was as the head of what was called the British Commonwealth Division. I said what it was called because that has since been broken up and divided between Asia and Europe and Africa and so forth.
And that included South Africa, of course.
That included South Africa. I held that position for the first 2 years. I held it for 5 years, in fact, until I went to Canada in 1953. But during that 5 years, about a little more than 2 years after the beginning, there was a reorganization in the Foreign Ministry, creating the post of Assistant Director General between directors of divisions and the Director General. Uh-huh. The first Assistant Director General was myself. So that during that period I was, and Levavi was the second. There were only two of us at the beginning. I was the senior of the two. That is that in the absence of the Director General, I was acting Director General of the Ministry. So I was the number two man in the Ministry at that time. In 1953, I went off to set up an embassy in Canada. I remained there until early 57. And while I was in Canada, I also participated in the delegations at the United Nations for the General Assemblies, or for special assemblies at when they happened. So I divided my time between Canada and the United Nations. I came back in early 57, resumed my previous post as Assistant Director General. Until the end of 1959, I took over from EBAN as permanent representative to the United Nations, position I held until 1967. 1967 to 1970, I had the title of political advisor to
That was after the Six-Day War.
Yes, political advisor to the foreign minister and ambassador at large. Any special assignments until I went to London as ambassador in 1970. Came back after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and then I retired from the service. That is my career in a
summary.
nutshell.
Yes. Not that we haven't got that information, but I just wanted to make it clearer.
Do you want tea or coffee?
Yes. In the period of those 5 years or so, when you headed the Commonwealth countries section, what was the progress of relations with Israel, bearing in mind that we're talking now about the nationalist government, which turned a blind eye to assistance to Israel and was cooperative on that level, but the impression that I have, although I've obviously not had access to the documents, but I once had a discussion with Shufot when he was working in that desk, and he told me orally that he had on occasion looked through the documents of that early period, and that in fact the record was overwhelmingly of great reluctance on the part of South Africa, first of all to recognize Israel de jure, which they did eventually in about May 1949, and secondly they had definite interests in the Arab world still, which weighed heavily with them. Could you describe your view of those developments in the early years?
Let me talk about the nature of the formal diplomatic relations. South Africa at that time showed no particular interest in opening a mission of its own in Israel. I doubt very much whether they were holding back because of major interests in the Arab world. I think they simply didn't, like every foreign service, is short of budget and good people and so forth. They were busy developing their external affairs department in the foreign service. Israel, from the point of view of South African needs, official needs on a governmental level, was very low on the priority list. Whatever tourism and aliyah, some investment, fundraising, all these things were being dealt with quite adequately through the channels of the Zionist Federation. South African government, this was quite satisfactory to the government. There were no practical pressures which might justify the expense and for opening a mission here, and I don't recall at that time that the South African government made any approaches to us on this matter. Not at that time. My department in the ministry was responsible in 1949 for at that time opening consulates general in these four countries: Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa. Not diplomatic missions yet in the strict sense. We sent very good people, high-level people, to be our representatives in these countries, but with the rank of consul general. And we made clear to the South African government that we were doing this unilaterally. We weren't making a condition that there should be reciprocity.
Did you not ask for them to reciprocate that?
No. In fact, we were not keen on their reciprocating.
That's important, yes.
We were not keen. It suited us very well that all these comings and goings between us and South Africa, money coming here from South Africa and all these things should go through federation channels and be handled by the federation rather than it should be handled through official government channels. So we had no interest in suggesting South Africans open up officially here. South Africa at that time didn't have any great interest in doing so, so it was simply left at that. A little while, Mr. Goitein, later Judge Goitein, went as our first Consul General to South Africa. Abe Harman went as Consul General to Montreal, Canada, and Australia, New Zealand as one unit. New Zealand was covered by our people in Australia.
Yes.
At a later stage, not long afterwards, we changed we left the consulates general in Johannesburg and in Montreal, but also opened up diplomatic missions in Pretoria, in Ottawa, and in Canberra, leaving the Consulate General in Sydney. Now, again, when we did that, we indicated that we did not insist on reciprocity, not only with South Africa, but also with Canada and Australia, New Zealand. At a much later stage, I don't remember quite when, there were some overtures from South Africa about the possibility of opening a mission here.
Overtures from the South African government or by the Jews urging it?
Well, the Jews were urging it. The South African government seemed to be receptive to the idea. We, again, were not particularly keen on this at that time.
Why not?
We felt that a South African mission over here at the time would wish to have much greater control of matters which were, from our point of view, being dealt with quite satisfactorily through Zionist channels and through the Federation.
In other words, the consideration at this stage was not yet the reaction of African countries.
No, not at that stage. At a later stage it was one factor, but not a decisive one. So we did, I myself remember talks with South African Zionist leaders when I explained to them that we did not welcome any pressure on their part, on their own government, for this purpose. And at a much later stage, the South African government did open a consulate general here, which has now become an embassy.
Can I just interrupt as a general point on Israel's foreign policy? I know in our relationship with India, for example, reciprocity was a very, very sensitive issue. And I think generally in Asia it's correct to say that there were many people in the Foreign Office trying to push improved relationships. Would you say South Africa was the only exception to this general point that I've made?
No, there were a number of other countries where we decided that even if those countries did not think it warranted from their own point of view to open a mission in Israel, but if we had interests, Jewish interests and other interests, political interests in their countries which made it warranted for us, we would go ahead on a unilateral basis and not press for it to be done on a reciprocal basis. Because this was done in in a great number of cases. South Africa was no exception. And as I've indicated, even when I opened at that time a legation in Ottawa, Canada did not reciprocate. A year after, I went there first as a minister, a year after I'd already been serving in Canada, Mr. Pearson said to me one day that the Canadian government wanted to play a more active role in the Middle East, that they therefore wanted to go ahead with opening 3 missions in the Middle East. One in Beirut, one in Cairo, and one in Israel. And he suggested that as between us, and they wanted to do this on the level of an embassy, so that I presented my credentials all over again, this time as an ambassador, doing exactly the same job. But we simply left it to them in their own good time to decide when to open up here, and in combination with what Arab countries, because they didn't want to open up here and not have links with the Arab countries simultaneously.
So in the period from 1948 to the 1953, when Malan visited Israel, it would not be true then, according to your description, to make out a picture of Israel chasing South Africa and asking for it to reciprocate relations, but South Africa not being willing to. It was really a mutual lack of interest in developing it further than that.
Absolutely. There was certainly no attempt made on our part to promote the South African mission in this country during that period. As a matter of fact, the 2 days that Dr. Malan spent here in 1953, I was more or less in charge of his visit, and I spent the whole of the 2 days with him, and we travelled throughout the Galilee and all that.
What was your impression of his reactions in Israel?
Oh, very, very favourable indeed. But he was not only him, but he had with him, you see, come from a Prime Minister's conference in London. South Africa was still in the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference. He was accompanied on his visit over here by the Secretary for External Affairs, who was then Forsyth. And Dr. Malan, Forsyth, and I spent 2 days together in travelling around the country. Neither Dr. Malan nor Forsyth even hinted at the possibility that they might want to open a mission here.
And how did he relate to you as a person in such a high position in Israel's foreign ministry, knowing that you were born not far from where he was born, in the Cape?
He got a great deal of pleasure out of it. I had I won't say a difference of opinion, but a somewhat different opinion to the majority. I was at that time still serving on the Israel Committee of the Zionist Federation in Tel Aviv in Ayakon Street. And I came along to a meeting of the Federation Committee, and with the program that I'd worked out for Dr. Malan's visit, which included a visit to what was then called Moshav Habonim on the coast, a South African settlement. And most of the members of the executive were not very happy about this. As they said, why thrust under Dr. Malan's nose the fact that there are so many South African Jews who've left South Africa and come to live here? He won't like it. He'll maybe think that this is disloyalty to South Africa. I said, no, you don't understand the Afrikaners. They don't. Said if this was going away to another country, they might think so. But for Jews to come to the Heilige Land, to the Jewish homeland, I said this to them is the most natural thing. We went to Habonim. He was entertained with tea there, and we sang Afrikaans songs, and he met South Africans all over, and it gave him he went back and told everybody what a wonderful job the South Africans were doing in Israel.
You spoke in English to him, I assume, most of the time.
In Afrikaans.
In Afrikaans?
Yes.
Yeah, your Afrikaans, as I imagine, was
yes.
proficient.
It was a bit rusty, but I had grown up in the
So you were able to speak
areas.
to him in Afrikaans?
Oh, yes.
Did you ever meet with Eric Lowe in that 61 period, or did you perhaps avoid directly meeting with him owing to the embarrassments of those relationships? And bearing in mind that Lowe, much more than Malan, had a very strikingly anti-Semitic background.
No, I'm well aware of it, because before the war, the time of the grey shirt movement in South Africa and the Eric Lowe bill and so forth, I was serving on the Board of Deputies. I was on the Cape Committee of the Board of Deputies, and we were fighting Eric Lowe all along the line, so I had very precious little sympathy for him. But I saw him frequently at the United Nations. Our relations were correct. And say, I was much friendlier with some of the other South Africans than I was with him, and I treated him with all courtesy as foreign minister of a country with which we had normal relations. But I didn't invite him socially to my home in New York, matters of that kind of thing. Although we had social relations with my South African colleagues at the United Nations amongst the permanent representatives.
Did you find that the South African delegation in the United Nations, in those friendly conversations, adopted an attitude similar to one which I've seen in some of the interviews with government ministers in South Africa, to the effect that while we understand why Israel is doing this, you will be sorry one day because it's never going to work, and they will reject all your advances and turn their backs to you. Was that an attitude that was prevalent too amongst them? Or did they refrain from directly discussing Israel's policies?
No, we discussed these things. There was at times that tone adopted, that you can't rely on the Africans, they'll let you down. But this wasn't a major feature of our talks. In fact, they were at a time trying to persuade people that they were trying to build bridges with the black African countries themselves. What I used to say to them was, I said that the job our people are doing in Africa, we're filling a vacuum. This is the job that's the country most natural to do it, the country which is on the African continent and much more industrially and technically and culturally advanced than any other, and should be doing the pioneer job of developing the African continent, is South Africa. So your own policies have debarred you from that role. That should have been your natural role if you didn't cut yourself off from it by your apartheid policies. I said that a good deal of what our people are doing for these Africans would in the normal course have been done by South Africans.
Well, I think at this point, an hour and a half having passed, we'll conclude the interview. Thank you.